Okay, thank you all for coming. Is this close enough? Translators, is that okay? No one has translation. Okay, so this event will be in English, therefore. Welcome, my name is Pasco Sabido from Corporate Europe Observatory. We're an organisation that looks at the influence of multinationals, particularly in Brussels and at the UN level. And I work on climate policy, so looking at the oil and gas industry and their capture. This is a very important event here at COP23, but I have to immediately make an apology as I'm not supposed to be here. I was drafted in at the last minute because a very close organisation to our own corporate accountability from the US was supposed to be here presenting, but they have had to go to another event. We've been working a lot on conflicts of interest within the UNFCCC, how some of the biggest polluters are wandering these halls and influencing the process. And yesterday we found out that the COP presidency has in fact called a special dialogue, the Telenoa dialogue, that will address conflicts of interest at the same time as corporate accountability was supposed to be in this room talking. Maybe it was a way to not have them in that dialogue, who knows? But either way, luckily, I was able to fill in for them, so apologies on their behalf. I really do hope in the Telenoa dialogue it is going well. So this event will be in two parts. We have a rich diversity of panelists here, and we're going to try and do two separate parts. The first will be on what is missing from the Paris Agreement. What needs to be in there if we're serious about getting to 1.5 degrees, about getting that ambition, getting a roadmap, the actual actions that are needed beyond talking about one day we'll get there. And then the second part will be on what are the things, not just that are not there, but that are completely not even being considered, out-of-the-box solutions that need to be in our approach to tackling climate change if we're going to have the systemic change that's needed, if we're going to follow the tenets of climate justice. So on my panel, maybe I'll introduce from left to right. We have Karolin Seitz, who is from, I've written it down here and I lost it, from it's Global Policy Forum, the program officer there, responsible for issues on business and human rights and corporate influence. And then just next to her, to my left, we have Lauron, who's in charge of climate justice at Ibon International. And then to my right, we have Titi Soentoro from AKSI for Gender, Social and Ecological Justice in Indonesia. And then finally, on the far right, we have Atama Katama with the Borneo Forum for Indigenous People. This is going to be our first panel, second panel, I think. Oh, no. First panel, second panel. We're going to mix and match a little bit. But as, unfortunately, corporate accountability weren't able to be here, I'm going to fill in for their piece on the panel too. So I'm going to wear a few different hats. Hopefully it won't be too confusing. So to begin with the first panel, what's missing from the Paris Agreement? I think had corporate accountability been here, they would have gone into some of the more technical details of how we can really ensure that to get to 1.5 in that ambition, the right people are in the room, and that also means that the wrong people are not in the room. That we make sure that those who are currently profiting from climate change and who have historically been holding us back through their lobbying activities at both national level and the international level are not included in these talks. And that includes, some of the biggest oil and gas players here. This is really the prerequisite for achieving the ambition we need to see. And in ambition, not just the ambition, but also some of the ideas we're about to hear on this panel will never be realized if those in the room are not able to take them seriously. And unfortunately, many of the things that will be mentioned will be against the interests of some of the biggest polluters. So we have this clash. And unfortunately, up to today, our governments and political leaders have been paying far more attention to those who are causing climate change than those who are serious about tackling climate change. So this is something that clearly needs to change. I want to maybe touch on here at the UNFCCC. We have these same corporations walking the halls and walking these corridors. I was only yesterday, or the day before, apologies, in the Dutch delegation office, and they were telling me that Shell are of course part of the solution. Shell being one of the historical biggest polluters, who has also known about climate change since the 70s and acted not to do anything, who's up there with Exxon, and who has a huge grip on the Dutch government. Because this is the important thing. It's not just at the UN level. It's what happens at the national level before countries get together and arrive in these talks. So when people are here in the UNFCCC, often the lobbying has already happened. Many governments will already have their positions. And maybe just to return to Shell in the Netherlands, they have a new government in the Netherlands, and their finance minister, does anyone know where they used to work? Shell. So Shell is now in charge of the finance ministry. Well, Shell, someone who used to be at Shell is in charge of the finance ministry. So this revolving door is one of these key ways of influencing climate policy. And at Corporate Europe Observatory, we just brought out a new report looking at the power of the gas lobby. And in the EU, which is such a big player here at the UNFCCC, often has the label of climate leader, lobbying of spending more than 100 million in 2016 from the gas lobby and more than 1,000 lobbyists on their payroll means that the EU is now investing billions and billions into new gas infrastructure. There's a new building program that not many people are aware of, which is going to completely blow its carbon budget. I mean, it's just impossible to meet it with all this new gas infrastructure, but it's not something you hear about here. Equally, Germany, with the lignite industry, if you look at the pavilion we have over here, it doesn't really mention lignite. Lots of renewables, not much lignite, but in fact, Germany is Europe's biggest lignite producer. And this is something, despite the Energiewende, perhaps because of, some might say, but it was a political choice to move towards lignite. So I think it's worth just mentioning that there's both these levels, and it's important to be acting at both of them. There has been a process in the UNFCCC. There has been a huge push from many progressive countries and civil society groups to address this conflict of interest, that those companies and actors who are clearly representing the economic interest responsible for climate change should not be involved in solving it. And in May, we had the first workshop involving parties and also civil society groups. And there, despite huge pushback from, unsurprisingly, Canada, Australia, the US, who have big fossil fuel interests, but also the EU. We have to say the EU has been a big blocker of this progress. So this process has been ongoing in May, and there was an agreement that at the next intersessional in May 2018, we would look at serious solutions based on written submissions of how to address conflicts of interest within the UNFCCC. And I think it's worth mentioning here at COP23, this issue was not supposed to be on the table. But thankfully, the Fiji presidency decided that today they would have the conversation on non-party participation. And so it is, well, I'm really hoping that as we're having this conversation here, there's a parallel conversation ongoing that's going to make sure this issue is not just raised, but dealt with. I mean, we need to see this problem fixed if we're serious about reaching the ambition held within the Paris Agreement. I will leave it there and pass on. Perhaps this is hopefully an overarching frame for we can't have those polluters in the room if we really want to meet the goals that we've set out to do. But maybe let's see what's not in the Paris Agreement that needs to be there if we're serious about tackling climate change. Let's begin so with Titi. And the question to yourself, so in terms of what's not in the Paris Agreement, specifically on, I guess, action, take the action. We hear a lot about targets, but on action and also financing, what needs to be in there?
First, about the Paris Agreement is overemphasis on the agreement itself, regardless of how little agreed among the parties. And then if we look at the actions, there's no clear action to meet the goals of staying below 1.5 degrees. So the Paris Agreement is clear not about emission reductions. Actions that we want to see is actually leaving a greater part of fossil fuel reserve in the ground, preventing further deforestation, how to do it, for examples, ending climate damaging industrialized agriculture practices, or limiting the world hunger for energy, or how to implement effective policy to put climate and gender justice as well as human rights above the profits. And also unclear messages related to the financing for protection and for adaptations. So financing should actually address to clear the historical debt of the industrialized countries to the developing countries, and also for transformations in the global south away from fossil fuel, including geothermal. That's some clear action that's actually needed to be discussed within.
Thank you, Titi. In terms of how is that going to get into these talks? I mean, we have the NDCs. Are they the right instrument to achieve 1.5 degrees, to bring these actions in?
So NDC is a self-defined commitment to achieve particular target by the governments. So the Indonesian governments, for example, saying that we will achieve 29% reduction if there is no support, but 44% if there is support. So it is inviting interventions to Indonesia, and usually inviting investment and open up places for private sector investment to do investment for the emission reduction in Indonesia. And we also see that within the situations of human rights and violations, then at the end, the problems of the people will be increased.
So they're not the best instrument?
No, because actually what we need is like a common objective about the standard that every country has to meet together. It's not like self-defined, I can do this much, I can do that much, and then the condition is like this and that. So, I mean, common target is important and binding.
Yeah. Thank you. So I guess this is the big difference from moving from Kyoto, which was top-down, to a bottom-up process, which was one of the main aims of the US. No secret about this, pushing for a bottom-up process of what everyone could do, regardless of whether it takes us to 3 degrees or more, as the UNDP's recent emissions gap report showed. So thank you, Titi. So from the sort of what should be there with gender justice, how to deal with this at the national level, going to Karolin, we see here what's lacking from the Paris Agreement that's really going to deliver just and sustainable development. I mean, this is your area of expertise. And what's standing in the way of getting this, of making sure the Paris Agreement can deliver for sustainable development and deliver for a just approach?
Yeah, thank you, Pasco. I think there is no secret that there is this dual relationship between climate change and sustainable development. Climate change influences environment and living conditions of people, and affects the basis of social and economic development. And on the other hand, the priorities a society sets for its development have implications on greenhouse gas emissions. So these two processes on sustainable development and climate change have been closely connected for a long time, I think. So what is really needed to implement the Paris Agreement in a just and sustainable manner? I have 3 points. The first one is that we have to respect human rights in actions against climate change. That's really key. We see that the existing energy system threatens development beyond climate change. It's coal mining, power plants, as well as petrol extraction often go along with severe human rights violations. And unfortunately, renewable energy and so-called clean technologies are not immune to human rights abuses. as we have seen, for example, batteries of electronic cars contain cobalt, which is often extracted in mines in the DRC Congo, where child labor is a common practice. So, for a really just and social transition, it is therefore crucial that the governments give high consideration to what they have been agreeing on in the preamble of the Paris Agreement, where they call parties should, when taking action to address climate change, respect, promote, and consider their respective obligations on human rights. And this includes that states take their responsibility to protect human rights, violations, and abuses within their territory and or jurisdiction, also by third parties, for example, by corporate actors and business enterprises. And this really requires to go beyond voluntary approaches and to establish binding rules on business and human rights, which have been discussed, for example, 2 weeks ago in Geneva in the Human Rights Council. My second point is that we have to question the actual partnership and multi-stakeholder approach, because there have been a coalition of civil society organizations and unions that have been published already for the second time, a so-called Spotlight Report on Sustainable Development, monitoring the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. And what I found out is there's a growing trend to promote business as the solver of today's challenges and to call for public-private partnerships and privatization. But this trend is based on the assumption that global problems are too big and that the public sector is too weak to solve them. But what is ignored is the question why the public sector is so weak, why it has become so weak. And that's actually true due to deregulation, business-friendly fiscal policies, tax avoidance, and increased market concentration, as well as powerful lobbying by corporate actors. What the authors of the Spotlight Report have also shown along different areas like food security, energy supply, health, education, is that the privatization and PPPs have really tremendous impacts also on the public and on people, high risks for them and high costs for the public sector, actually. So also for the Paris Agreement and action towards achieving the Paris Agreement is important to assess which tools to mobilize private resources and incentivize actions against climate change really serve best for people. And there I'm coming to my third point, that is that we have to reclaim policies for the public and really strengthen participatory and democratic governance structures. That means that we have to take back privatized services into public hands, remunicipalization of, for example, water supply, or community-controlled and decentralized energy systems. But I think Titi will mention more on this aspect.
Thank you very much. And this increasing involvement of business feels like it's come also, like you say, in place of public participation and public efforts. But this gets to the real core of the climate problem and of these negotiations about who's responsible and who's going to pay for the problem. Because I think what we've seen, the underlying tenet of climate justice, is that actually those who are most responsible should be paying for it. Those who are in the global north should be paying money and should be providing the resources to the global south. So how is this question of inequality between countries and also within countries dealt with? It feels like it's going for, don't worry, business will just sort it out and we'll let the market deal with it, even though the market has clearly failed in tackling climate change. How is this inequality question between North and South and also within being dealt with?
Yes, I think it's really crucial that that horizontal as well as vertical inequalities in and between countries have been to be tackled also in actions against climate change, and with the SDG 10 in the Sustainable Development Goals, this is also a very important element. And well, we have seen the World Economic Survey and Social Survey last year has seen that inequalities even exacerbate climate impacts on the poor. And the report further describes that much of the harm is not by accident, but actually it is due to the failure of governments to close the development gaps that leave large populations at risk. So keywords, I think, are CBDR, questions who controls and who has access to technology and innovation, and to which costs.
Thank you, Karolin. How are we doing for time? 11:56. So we were thinking we could have just a quick round of burning questions for our two panelists before moving on to the second part, which is thinking outside the box, and then have a deeper discussion at the end. Are there any sort of burning questions, clarifications, follow-ups that people would like to ask? But if not, we can save it all to the end. Okay, so maybe we save it to the end, and we move on to Atama Katama from the Borneo Forum. The question, this side event is called Thinking, what are the solutions out of the box? From your perspective, what are those solutions that are not being considered here at all from your own experiences as an Indigenous person in Borneo?
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be on this panel. Tell you the truth, that's a huge question for humanity to answer. Before we talk about this, I just want to speak to your heart, to your heart conscience. I want to speak to your ancestors in this room, through my ancestors, to the spirit of the earth and the guardians of the forest that I've brought all the way from Borneo. When we say out of the box, that means we are already in a box. We are a box just like how you go for your fast foods in McDonald's. Going for your nourishing food in the forest is outside the box. You are controlled when you are inside a box. But when you are in the forest free, like the birds, like the monkeys, like the spirits of the forest roaming through the forest, just like how your ancestors and my ancestors continue to do in the rainforest, that is truly out of the box. So as I speak to you, to your heart's conscience, I do not have to speak to your ears, to your mind, because your minds are trained to be in this box of materialism, consumerism, pursuit of power, pursuit of ego, pursuit for the destruction of everything that we all stand for on this planet. We are all energy beings. And when we pursue corruption and means of capturing anything such as another person's energy field, another forest's field, another land's fields, such as the coals that are undisturbed, they have their energy fields, just like the oceans that has been disturbed. It has been disturbed of its energy field. When we are tampering with these energy fields, the energy will bite us back. You have learned about the stories of Atlantis, a great civilization, high technology, that when they had this certain power, the earth energy wiped them out. We are now speaking to your heart and informing you, reminding you and your ancestors and your energy and your beings that history will repeat. If you do not realize who you are and the amount of energy that you are putting into inside the box, start thinking about putting your energy, connecting to energies outside of the box, and the energies that I'm talking about is the natural energy of the planet. I'm concerned as Indigenous peoples because our elders, who are the last front line, who can speak to the planet, who can speak to the spirits of the forest, who can speak to the spirits of the mountain, who can mediate between human beings who have done so much hurt on the planet, who have killed millions and millions of the fellow human beings through wars, atrocities, because of the greed. We have been communicating with the spirit to ask for forgiveness. And we do that through our sacred ceremonies, rituals, and practices. And this, my kumburungo, is one of the only ways that we can connect to the living spirit. This is going to be gone very soon because of the consumption that the world wants to bring inside the box. So I want to speak to your heart consciousness and your ancestors today and invite you all, your hearts, our ancestors, to come together once again, but outside the box. We can build a new field of energy, a new field of life that we do not need corporate greed, that we do not need to allow for the drilling of natural resources, for the exploitation of our lands for oil palm. And even we don't need the geoengineering to change weather patterns to suit plantations, mega plantations, to give them water, or use weather weapons to create funding to provide aid into disasters. This is what's going on in our realm, inside the box. I want to leave us with a question to you. What is your outside the box? You answer it through your heart to transmit the energy outside the box so you can connect back to nature. So you can finally realize what Indigenous peoples are doing at the COP and why we are offering so much of our traditional knowledge. We offer you one thinking, and in my experience, the Sustainable Development Goals negotiations, where there are private sectors, the industries are asking for the rights of artificial intelligence. They are asking for the rights to explore space, to colonize other planets. And for Indigenous peoples like myself to hear this inside the box, I can only respond to them by saying, we will never discriminate your right, but do not discriminate our right to defend the earth. We are entitled to communicate with the earth and the energies, and we are not leaving. We are the ones entitled to protect the earth as long as we can. This, to me, is the thinking outside of the box through the spirit, without the heart of consumerism, without the heart of capitalism, without the heart of domination over other peoples, over other spaces, over the environment, over the air, land, water, resources, and the oceans. To me, this is what out of the box means. I take this opportunity now to close by saying, I bless you all in the name of my 2,000 ancestors from Borneo that's come with me through this very divine plant here. And I bless you all and your spirits and your heart, because you have been, in my understanding, deep understanding, called to be here to think outside the box. Thank you.
Thank you very much. How does that, apart from you being here, how does that structurally make its way into these talks, into this agreement? Because that feels so far removed from what they're talking about in those halls and those negotiators. How do we make this happen?
First of all, I think creating space for nature. We have seen a tribunal for nature. It needs to be beyond that. We need to be bringing these indigenous peoples who have the ability to communicate and bring them inside in this process, to share this knowledge to everybody. And actually, Pascal, we are moving through the Indigenous Peoples Caucus. And this year, the Indigenous delegations are here to solidify the Indigenous Peoples platform, which is also being negotiated here. And if the states agree and provide resources, if the UN facilitates this, we would be in COP and be partner with everyone to bring that particular energy. But the question is, will we be given the space?
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Lauron. The floor is yours.
You're not even going to ask me a question.
I mean, Tetet just doesn't need any introduction or anything. So, we'll ask a question. No, we've already discussed what's missing from the Paris Agreement. But what are your thoughts on how these negotiations are going to come even close to the aspirations of keeping runaway climate change in check, stopping this, agreeing solutions that don't go further in actually harming the environment, and also delivering on climate justice? It's a word used quite a lot, more and more here, but I don't know whether the real meaning comes through. How do we actually make sure the Paris Agreement delivers this in ways that have not even been discussed here?
Okay, thanks very much, Pasco. And I think I have 4 items that I want to contribute to this conversation. Yeah? So I think the first point would be ambition and commitment to action cannot just be limited within the confines of what's been put into the Paris Agreement. Yeah? Everyone here talks about implementing the Paris Agreement as if Paris is enough. Because we've already seen that with the current pledges on the table, and this can still be reviewed by member states, and they can say, oh, we've pledged too much. We can take back something more, something else. So let's not be trapped in that box of saying, we heart Paris Agreement so much and we want to make it work, because we want to increase the ambition that's in the Paris Agreement, because it's simply not enough. It will still lead the world to anywhere between 3 to 7 degrees warming, and we all cannot afford that, no? The second point I would like to make is that the UNFCCC needs to put its own house in order. Yeah? There's a lot of things that are in the Paris Agreement, but there's so many more that are not in the agreement, nor in the negotiations. For instance, no one's talking about military emissions. And we know that there's a lot, especially with wars and military exercises happening left and right in the name of resource extraction, in the name of securing borders, in the name of securing trade routes. So this is not being talked about in the negotiations. We need to put that on the table, either through actions around the transparency framework, because that's how things get put on the table. No, you have to put them in some kind of a fancy technical packaging that negotiators would understand. But us mere mortals, we have a hard time doing that. It also has to be factored into the reporting guidelines. No, financing. It's always a sticky issue in the negotiations. But I think if we need to think outside the box, member states, developed countries particularly, are saying there's not enough money because we also have our own economic problems within our own borders. So why don't we challenge them to redirect useless, unproductive, destructive military spending into climate adaptation, into loss and damages, into actually helping people get above their heads? No, it's not enough that we talk about sympathy to people, the poor, the vulnerable. We have to make them put their money where their mouths are. third, we've already mentioned it earlier, around the conflicts of interest, around false solution. The next point I would like to make is that climate is a global problem that is interconnected with everything else. No, so we cannot talk about climate seemingly as only an environmental problem. It has to be looked upon in the bigger context of how climate problem interacts with the trade architecture, with the finance architecture, with all of this SDG infrastructure. We can no longer think in silos. And that would also give flesh to our calls in the climate justice movement for a need for system change. No, it's not just environment or climate that needs to be addressed, but the whole system, the whole infrastructure that is feeding into this climate problem needs to be overhauled. It has to be a system reboot. No, we cannot just tweak the nuts and bolts, but it has to be an overhaul of the system. And the last point I'd like to make is about inclusion and ownership. Enough of these high-level meetings, you know, the annual jamboree of frequent flyers, and even us in civil society, we're guilty, no? We need to follow these negotiations, yeah? Enough of the tokenistic approaches, and we need to have those difficult conversations around the reality that in this beautiful world of SDG, leaving no one behind, the reality is that the spaces are closing for civil society. The spaces are closing for human rights defenders, for environmental defenders. We are being killed, harassed, arrested for speaking truth to power. So we need to find way. You know, if our negotiators are not representing us in these negotiations, we need to find ways and strategies of how to bring our agenda into these spaces while also maintaining that the UN alone will not solve the problems. The UN will never deliver on system change. So how do we now use these moments for us to build stronger movements, to build stronger connections, and use our power both inside and outside?
Thank you very much, Tete. I mean, as a follow-up question, how do we actually get that into the Paris Agreement? How do we make sure that come next year in Katowice, 2018, we're going to be finalizing this rulebook for Paris, no? How do we make sure that these things that you're talking about, which are clearly important, which are not being considered, how do we get them in there?
I think that's the pragmatic in me would say it's going to be a very tough climb, no? To even get the governments into thinking and considering those agenda that will surely expose them. You know, how do you get the US, the EU to support reporting on emissions? Because they're the ones that are actually creating war everywhere, no? In our countries and communities. But we have to start somewhere. And I think this kind of exchanges inside this space is a good start. And if we get traction, then we can probably, you know, take a lot more initiatives that would actually challenge, you know, what's being covered in the transparency framework, what's being called, how do they design this Talanoa dialogue? And I'm hoping that our folks at Corporate Accountability are raising these difficult questions as well to the Fiji presidency, because these are the things that matter. And these are the things that would somehow, you know, give meaning to all us civil society frequent flyer travelers to these climate jamborees.
Thank you. So we've had what should be in the Paris Agreement, which perhaps many of these things were actually dropped after the Kyoto negotiating track finished, when we had the Paris platform. After Durban put in its own little track and then forgotten about, many of these things need to be brought back in, but there's also these bigger ideas. But we're wondering from yourselves, I mean, are there questions, are there thoughts? We wanted this to be a little bit more interactive. So I was thinking taking a round of 3 questions to any of our speakers. Please state your name and where you're from. We have a roving microphone, but I'm going to also try and ensure we have a balanced questions in terms of who gets to speak. So would anyone like to ask a question? Please put your hand in the air. We have one. I was thinking in a round of 3, if we have 3 people. Okay, so I think we have, one, and then yourself at the back, and then, yeah, great.
Hi everyone, I'm Vladimir from Engineers Without Borders. and I'm from France. First of all, I'm in the UNGO Climate of Interest Working Group, Conflict of Interest Working Group, and normally this finance conflict of interest will be mentioned in the other meeting at the Bula zone normally. Tomorrow it's the Yungo Day and also the Bingo Day. So Yungo it's for youth NGOs and Bingo is for business and industry NGOs. We do not have the same interest, not at all. Can we, I don't know if the UN can change the meaning of NGOs and have to separate this NGO word, I don't know, to have two specific definitions because we cannot be put in the same NGOs word. So,
thank you very much. We have to just raise your hand again. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sasha Gabizon. Yeah, I think you're very right, all of you. Ted, also your last comments on that. We won't change things if we follow the rules here all the time, so we need to do other things. And I was going to ask maybe all of you, what can we do to bring companies to court cases, to make them to pay? What are your examples? We know that public pressure can help to get investors out of extractive projects if there is a lot of public pressure. We have seen the fantastic event at the coal mining area here on Sunday. We know that in Munich they just voted, had a referendum to get the city to get out of coal. What can we do to stop the big mine in Australia they want to build? How can we use all the energy we have in this room to also then work in solidarity and to support the causes we have heard from Borneo, the palm oil, and how can we make that something which we're already doing, but which enters also maybe more and more into international negotiations. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about the work which is happening on business and human rights. There was just a big meeting about it as well. So how can we use these other instruments and other spaces? Thank you.
And then yourself here.
Hi, my name's Alice. I'm from Less Meat, Less Heat, and I just wanted to ask a question about overconsumption, just because a lot of the negotiations are focused on the production side of things, when actually a lot of the emissions come from the overconsumption of lots of things in the most developed, the wealthiest countries. But looking at behaviour change doesn't seem to be taken into consideration very much. I mean, obviously it's quite difficult to do, but then it's all quite difficult to do. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Thank you very much. So, who would like? We have a question on changing the definition of NGOs to stop business being called NGOs, which is quite an interesting, occurrence. Then we have how to bring companies to court cases, how to get this idea of holding companies to account more into negotiations, and particularly on sustainable development, human rights, and then a question of overconsumption. I mean, perhaps, Karolin, would you like to take maybe the second?
Yes, I think I will respond to a question from Sasha. Well, 2 weeks ago in Geneva, there have been in the Human Rights Council discussion about a so-called binding treaty on business and human rights that should go beyond voluntary approaches that have been established, for example, by the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights in 2011. And this last session was already the third session where concrete elements have been discussed. For example, how to hold corporations that have abused human rights liable. So it means we have to establish civil, criminal and administration liability for corporate abuse. Then there was this element, or it was debated about the human rights due diligence that should be binding for all, for especially transnational corporations, but also locally based corporations. Such a law is already existing in France, for example, since February. Another very important issue has been to improve access to remedy for victims of human rights abuses. There are really horrible barriers to victims, especially when the corporation have abused human rights abroad. So these barriers have to be removed. And another really important issue, and then I think that's also with regard to system change, is how we can put primacy of human rights over investor rights and trade and investment regimes. And there are different proposals how this could be done, and it's actually possible to make such a hierarchy of human rights over investors' rights, or privileges, we would maybe rather say.
And Teta, anything to add?
Maybe I will just answer to the one about overconsumption. I think you're totally right, no? That the issue of overconsumption is being highlighted so much, and it's taking away some of the more critical discussions around production systems. For me, overconsumption is such a northern conception, because for us coming from the south, we underconsume actually. No, there's so much underconsumption. We are underserved, so the idea of overconsumption is alien to us. But in the larger scheme of things, this is the trend here in the UN, you know, further blurring the distinction between North and South, presenting climate change as a global problem that everyone needs to solve equally. You know, it's really watering down the very principles of the UNFCCC, which is around historical responsibility, that kind of thing. No? So I think we need to bring it back to the basics. What are the foundational principles that the UNFCCC is supposed to uphold? I don't know how many of you have read this article, that there seems to be a proposal coming from Fiji, even before the COP started, and that is around developing countries already revisiting their mitigation pledges, so that, you know, they can already ratchet up or amp up their ambitions and what they've put into this pledging basket. So I think that's quite dangerous, because for a country like Fiji, which is drowning already, you know, and facing, you know, severe impacts of climate change, they should not be championing mitigation commitments from developing countries, but should instead be championing, you know, calling developed countries to increase their own pledges and actions around climate change. So these are the things that we need to be watching out for in the coming weeks. And I totally support, you know, that it's not an issue of, we should not ride on to that overconsumption bandwagon, but instead bring back the arguments to the fundamentals, those things that really matter for us.
And Titi?
So it's to respond to Sasha, based on the experience of Indonesia. So like 2-3 weeks ago, a network in Indonesia celebrate a win, because they win over a court case on the privatization. They sue the Indonesian governments for privatize one of the water in Jakarta area, and after a long process, finally they won. So it is one of the struggle they use, and also to give an impression that water privatization is actually a human right violations, and acknowledge then through the court case by the state. And the other case is the court case brought by the indigenous people groups for acknowledging their rights on the land, because actually the state acknowledged the rights of indigenous people of for their land, but it's frozen when the state needs it. So it means what they say, it is your land. But if I need it, so it's my prerogative to use it. So I mean, there's a court cases that we can use, citizen lawsuit and so on, and that's one of the strategies using by the movements. I think.
And Atama?
Coming from this angle, I think when it comes to global solidarity, such as, for example, the Standing Rock, the community back in Borneo had a ceremony and prayer to send power to the brothers and sisters there. And if you recall, there was a time there that the bison came. Remember that? The bison came from nowhere. Now, who do you think is that in action? It's the spirits, and it's their ancestors. So do remember these things. This might sound like out of this world. Actually, it is inside the world. On palm oil and indigenous people struggles in the court of law, it's push and shove. We can win we can win the session court, we can win the high court, but but corporations have the money to hold as long and drag the community as long as possible to win at the federal level. And very bad news, my friends. 3 days ago, the Federal Court of Malaysia has made a judgment that will affect 20 years of work for the defense of the native customary right, because the court had said what has been given to the corporation will never be returned back to the community. Yo, please check this out. Sarawak NCR case. So it's not always the best avenue for indigenous peoples, but we have something to offer from our part of the world. We have what is called the native court. The native court is a mediation court. No money involved. It's not a statutory court or a commerce court, which we know in the civil court, right? You know that. So let's think out of the box. How about we support the idea for an international court of justice based on customary law, where the judges are your shamans. Let them invite nature to give the judgment with no money, no payment to the lawyer involved. And I think for this avenue to create a discussion, we can look around the UN Convention on Biodiversity, which has Article 8J around conservation, community, and this kind of thing. So we can explore this kind of thing. And I think this would really give back natural justice where we need it the most right now.
Thank you very much. Maybe just to abuse my position as speaker as well as chair, just to touch Vladimir completely. I mean, the business has the same status as non-government organizations who do not have a direct financial interest in the outcome of these negotiations is a travesty. It's crazy. But it shows where we're at, no? And I think this really links, I think it needs to be changed, even as a symbolic change, just to be able to say, actually, there is a difference. These guys over here have a direct vested interest in outcomes. Over here, we have public interest. And I think we need to be really clear on this difference. We are not all in this together. We haven't all got skin in this game in the same way. My profits are not going to tumble if we have an ambitious climate deal. My shareholders are not going to attack me if we have an ambitious climate deal. So I think we need to be really, really clear about who's in here and why, and make sure they're not all lumped together. But this maybe brings me to, I think, Sasha's point. How do we get these bit court cases, bit fights against corporations more into the negotiations? I think we also have to be aware of what these negotiations are. Climate change itself is a symptom of a far bigger problem. And if we don't tackle this bigger problem of realizing that this problem comes from our economic system and looking at who's in charge of our economic system, which it's those same people who are, they're here under a bingo badge, those ones in charge of our economic system, then we're not going to tackle climate change. So how do we go about this? And for me, this is, we need to fight on the, as I think Tete put it beautifully, we need to fight on all these fronts to link up the military, the fight against the military spending and militarization, against increasing borders, on more trade deals. But how do we have this culture change? Because this is what's at the heart of it, no? Why are we creating treaty after treaty in trade deals which give yet more rights to corporations? Why are our governments doing that when they're supposed to be representing the public? It seems illogical that we're going to hand over democratic power to business in the name of people. I don't know where the logic comes from, but until we have a culture change within these governments, that's not going to happen. And how do we have that culture change? That comes from building power. That comes from working with Indigenous folks. That comes from working with those on the front lines, with people of color, queer and trans and feminist communities. How do we go about doing this? This is about building power at a far more local level. And only then do we get into these halls, because these halls are a reflection of what's happening outside. And we've got a lot of work to do. I mean, we have in the US, we have Trump. I mean, Trump is seen as this big polluting bad man, and he is, of course, but Trump is also this symptom of where we are now. So how do we build power? And I've been very inspired by groups like Global Grassroots Justice Alliance and others who are doing that fight, working with the labor unions, working with frontline communities of color in the US to make sure we're building that power. Because only then can you try and recapture that power, that political power, and make that feed in here. It's a very long way to go, but it's very, very necessary. And it has to happen. I mean, I will also work on the municipal level, looking at corporate power, stopping progressive municipal projects in places like Spain and Italy and France. And there you have the same polluters who are trashing these talks, trying to stop us having the remunicipalization policies that Karolin was talking about, stopping us democratizing, I'm not even going to say nationalizing, re-democratizing public services, taking it back into local public hands. So we need to be connecting these levels and fighting at all levels. And only then, for me, only then do we have an impact here in the UNFCCC. But it's a big battle, and it is, as Tete said, we end up in silos. So how do we break those silos? And I think that has to happen in each of our countries back home. So we're building that power back home before we then are able to come here and represent with a far bigger voice the real fight and the real movements that we are building back home. But I'm going to take another round of questions. Put your hands up. So we have one at the back. Bear with me. We have one just, hold on. We have a microphone coming. So do we have any more hands? I see two already.
That was good.
Sorry, this is my soapbox. Let's go one, and then at the back.
Hello everybody, my name is Bastiaan Rood. I'm a board member of the European Youth Forum. It is a pleasure to be here, and it's amazing to see so many powerful fighters against climate change. But nevertheless, I haven't heard a single of you responding to the gentleman's question on the connection of youth rights and the position of Youth Day together with Business Day. I find it quite a coincidence, and I find it a bit weird. For us, young people are on your side, and we are together in this because we are here now, but we will also be the future generations. Maybe not the current power, but we are the future power. And in that, together, we need to work together. We need to break the silos indeed, but with young people. And in that, I also want to ask you, how can we make sure that we break the silos and include young people? Because young people have the right to participate. And especially, I think from the Global North, we are here present in way bigger numbers, but also from the Global South. And in general, within delegations, we already have a lot of youth delegates within our delegations. But in what way can you help us to make sure that we are one strong civil society movement, to make sure that we tackle our common interest and fight for our common rights? Because I think together we can make a chance to stop climate change. But I want to hear, how can we do this together with young people? Thank you.
At the back here? Yeah, yourself. We'll pass. Oh. We have self-delivering mics. It's great.
Good morning. I'm Arze Glipo from the Asia Pacific Network for Food Sovereignty and from the Philippines. My concern is with integrating the indigenous peoples' agenda, traditional knowledge, rights in these processes, and because there have been concerns with regard to the piracy of traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples, and so we have to be very vigilant about this. There is a trend among UN institutions about co-production of knowledge, coming, of course, from the institutions and from the communities. So we have experience on that, and it creates, of course, a lot of worries because, of course, the intellectual property regime, which is there, which is being used by companies, and of course, in the research and development, it might lead to more dispossession of indigenous peoples. And here it brings me to the point that I think it's more fundamental, no, to build power at the local, and I think the recognition and protection of the rights of indigenous peoples, for example, and other vulnerable sectors, farmers including, should be built, of course, at the local level, and then grounding up from the national and the international. So I believe, I fully agree that more fundamental is to build the democratic movements of farmers, indigenous peoples, for them to assert their power, to have control on their resources, on their land, on natural resources, forest, and water. And I think that is the challenge for all of us, and I think that is the motivation for coming here, because we all believe in the out-of-the-box solution, and when we say system change, I think the democracy, the genuine democracy, should be built on the ground. And of course, the challenge now is, even for the indigenous people, at the local level, they're not recognized. So I think we should be using this, this momentum. Of course, that is a momentum. I don't know, maybe there is a business agenda for including the indigenous people, but we have to use this momentum to really put power on the indigenous communities. And of course, on the other sectors. My concern is we are a food sovereignty movement, but let's say there is also this push for climate smart agriculture, which of course they are using even the organic farming, no? To also put in the corporate agenda. But we are pushing for organic farming, which is local farming, natural farming, agroecological practices, and then that of course the local food system can feed the world. So I think that is my take in this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And do we have a third question? Preferably, apologies, I was looking for someone who wasn't a straight man, if possible, but if not, go for it. We're trying to have more balance. It's a good thing to have in the UNFCCC, huh?
Thank you. And really interesting panel indeed. Very sympathetic to a lot of what I've heard this morning. Just interested, oh yeah, my name is Charlie Zajcek. I also work for the Overseas Development Institute. I work in climate policy communications, and I'm really interested to find out a little bit more about how we can package climate justice in terms of grassroots communication. So how can we create more public momentum around climate justice? How can we find those new audiences? I suppose Standing Rock is a great example of where there's been this broad coalition that goes beyond partisan politics. So just really interested to get the panel's view on potential future avenues for this kind of grassroots communication. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have, beginning with youth, maybe we start from the right this time. So we have on how do we build this power with youth groups and make sure this is being integrated and building together. Piracy and biopiracy, and also this building of democracy. And then how do we have grassroots struggles that can be really, I guess, touchstone issues.
Thank you. I want to address the young people. The indigenous peoples have an Indigenous Youth Caucus. It is based in the UN forums. And over the many years, I know for a fact that they have been trying to reach to other recognized and formally recognized youth organizations. So to the European Youth Forum, may I just recommend just a call to the leaders of the young people. I'll introduce you to them and take it on from there and try to build upon conversations where you guys share the space and you guys address the needs for the future. And I'm sure the young indigenous peoples also have a lot to share with you. You are right, my colleague from the Philippines, we are the defenders of the food and nutrition, and in the future, where the future cities are the hotspots on the planet, indigenous peoples are kind of designed to provide the highest nutrients possible for consumption in the cities. Now, I'm getting this language from the Food and Agriculture Organization. So they already have an agenda. Now, to come back and use whatever available opportunities that we have in the UN, we have in the CBD, that's binding. Like, for example, UNRIP may not be binding, so that's another question, right? But what I'm saying is we can use available instruments that we have at this level, but most importantly, at the community level, we have to defend what we are planting, we have to defend our land, we have to defend our resources, and there are things like community protocols that we can make. For example, in Sabah, where I come from, the federal court, the federal constitution recognizes adat, protocol adat. So those are, we will use those in that setting when the time comes. But we need to be more vigilant. Intellectual property is huge, enabling for the business, right? So I think you already have the answers, and I really give props up to you and you have reminded me more than I have given my thoughts out of the box. So thank you for grounding us.
Okay, still about the youth. In our work at home, we don't make a dichotomy between you are young, you are old, therefore your struggle is different from our struggles. If a projects come to our places, then it affects everyone, whether it is a baby, whether it is an old people. So the struggle is a struggle of everyone. So we work together because the rights is violated, because it is about our life which is destroyed. So maybe because the youth issue is more and more recently, whether it is at national, at international level, but we need to be grounded that this is everyone's problems, and we work together for that without make a distinction related to age. But in the organization, for examples, then I come from AKSI, but still a member of Women's Solidarity for Human Rights. We have developed mechanism, for examples, that one person's at least only, at utmost only 6 years as the executive, then give places for young generations that we have, that we build the capacity and give space for learning and get experiences. But I think we need to remember that the struggle is our common struggle, you know. And also related to the how to package the climate justice. You know, once you have the problems at the ground, you know, you don't have food because of the drought. And then how you package it as climate justice, because it is about experience, you know. You just start with your experience and then trying to understand the situations, then you feel that's this injustice experience. I think we need also to be based from the experience of the common people, because once they define the injustices, then it is stronger, rather than a nice packaging with paper and glancing paper and so on. So it is important, therefore, to work with the community, to explore their experience because of the changing climate, and then thinking together why, because it's a policy which is not just to them because of certain procedure which is affected their life, certain projects that expropriate their land, livelihood, and so on. So it should be based on that.
Thank you. I'm just going to quickly, on the youth question, around conflicts of interest, we're in touch already with members of the working group within Youngo, and it's a really important thing. For sure, working with youth has always been a key part of what we do, and I guess it's not really something thought about in that has to be working with youth, it's just something that comes quite naturally. But I also say youth is not a homogenous group. I mean, there's been huge struggles from the working group of conflicts of interest to get this agenda item through, to get support from the youth group. So I don't ever see youth as a homogenous group, and I work with those who are fighting for what we believe in and completely on the same level, and there's this level of equality. So we're really glad that we have the support of the working group in Youngo that's doing that. And if we can try and, I don't know, when's the business day? Tomorrow? No. Monday? When's the business bingo day? Business day is tomorrow, youth day is tomorrow. So they're both tomorrow. I mean, if you have some interesting actions, I think, to be honest, I think that'd be a really nice opportunity to do something quite vocal. So let's talk about this afterwards. I seem to find myself doing lots of these things. And that would be brilliant. And then perhaps just on the film, on how to frame the climate justice issue here in Europe, where I'm involved in, I guess, a nascent movement against gas. We've had a lot against coal, and what we're trying to create is the same thing against gas. We've got a lot of communities who are either along pipeline routes which are being built, or sites of extraction, such as in the Netherlands, where people's houses are cracking into from the earthquakes in Groningen, or fighting fracking. A lot of communities are rising up, and this, for me, I completely agree with Titi, is, how do we get those who are experiencing on the front line to be able to talk about that and give them the space? And I think that was what was really powerful about Standing Rock. And I think it's what we need to be creating more and more. And in Europe, we sort of think we need to look elsewhere. In Europe, it's happening as well. So I think we need to, of course, always be global and making these links. But one thing happening, just to let people know, on the 14th of November is a European Day of Action against the Trans-Adriatic Pipeline. It's a massive pipeline that's going to be coming from Azerbaijan to Italy. Azerbaijan, full of human rights problems, chucking people in jail on trumped-up charges, any political prisoners, any political opponents to the project. And the last leg is going Greece, Albania, under the Adriatic Sea, and supposed to come out in Italy, and it's had huge resistance. And there you've got communities rising up. And so the 14th of November will be a no-tap Trans-Adriatic Pipeline Day in solidarity with those communities. So it's how do we find these struggles that represent what's going on and bring them into the light. I think it's really important. And maybe just one thing that you should look at if you haven't, Thank You for the Rain is also a brilliant film of a Kenyan farmer who is facing climate change and living with it, and then comes to the UNFCCC, comes to COP21, and realizes, well, I won't ruin it, but go and watch it, and it's a brilliant frontline story.
I think we need to reclaim the concept of climate justice. It's not just about making it sexy and attractive and, in a nice packaging, but we need to reclaim the essence because it's been co-opted. I have problems when Mary Robinson talks about climate justice and sees that her concept of climate justice is so much different from where I'm coming from. So I think we need to reclaim, pretty much like sustainable development. Before Rio, sustainable development was just a term used by activists until it became mainstreamed. So maybe the problem is of us trying to mainstream our concepts, and it's being abused and misused and bastardized already. So let's reclaim what it means to really be fighting for climate justice, which means emphasizing the intersectionality. So we've talked about that a lot already, but in the end, climate justice is principally a justice issue that talks about inequality, it talks about power relations, yeah? And maybe I would like to leave this piece with you, because nowadays the narrative is about 100% RE if you want to save climate. Yeah? So everyone feels good about going renewable energy. But sorry, for us in the South, renewable energy kills. Renewable energy takes food away from our tables. So maybe we can try to see how we get our narratives straight so that we don't just fall into that mainstreaming, warm, fuzzy feeling propaganda. Because for us, just to make it clear, agrofuels are being packaged as renewable energy. But what does it mean for us? It means for us in the South, agricultural lands devoted for food production are being converted for agrofuels for export. And that means so that Europeans, North Americans can continue with their European lifestyle, with their American lifestyle without feeling so much guilt as consuming fossil fuels because it's renewable energy. Yeah? So maybe we need to get those narratives straight. When agrofuel companies come into our communities because our governments are packaging it as foreign investment opportunities, it means bringing the military with them so that they can clear away our communities to accommodate these kinds of plantations, palm oil, etc., etc. So maybe climate justice is about getting our narratives right and that we don't pit northern struggles versus southern struggles, because we are all facing one huge struggle and we all need to make ourselves stronger without contradicting each other. Thank you.
Well, I just think my previous colleagues have already added important points. I don't want to add anything.
Cool. So we have maybe we'll do some, we're on time, we'll do some wrapping up. Just to say so, after I'm going to do a quick wrap up, but then I'm going to do the one sort of wrap, and then Atama is going to do another sort of rap. We're actually going to have some music, some live music here, and we're probably going to try and get people to participate a little bit. We'll see how lively you're feeling. But I mean, so we've heard a lot of things that need to be in the Paris Agreement, and a lot of things which are nowhere near the Paris Agreement. And we've got very little time to get them in there. It has to be said. You know, and this, what happens here, what happens next year, this is going to determine what happens the next 10 years. This is going to determine whether we tackle climate change or not, or whether we do it in this space or not, shall I say. But all of these things that have been suggested, they're not in there for a reason, I think we have to say. And we have to be really clear about what that reason is, because they completely go against the current economic model and economic system, the way we produce our energy, the way we produce our food, and the companies behind it, the system that we've built up through the age of fossil fuels, what we're calling sort of development in the north. And that economic system has spawned a political representation that is incredibly powerful. Here in the talks. So I'll just say Corporate Europe Observatory, along with Corporate Accountability, Asian People's Movement for Debt and Development, Action Aid International, ETC Group, released a report last week looking at corporate influence over the talks. And it's not just, I mean, we did a piece on sponsorship, but it's not just the clear manifestations where you see BNP and Iberdrola who are sponsoring these talks. It's also the fact that in the Article 6 towards markets, we're seeing increasing push towards market mechanisms which are only going to benefit the private sector or those in the global north. We're seeing it, as we heard already from our colleague from the Philippines, in agriculture, this push for climate-smart agriculture from the fertilizers industry, from the big agribusiness players like Monsanto, that's not going to be climate-smart. It's going to destroy the lives of peasants and small-scale farmers. We're seeing it in technology being pushed. We already heard about geoengineering and others, and this is being pushed through. We're seeing it in the Global Climate Fund, that we're moving towards not just private sector and big private sector participation and a focus on private finance. We're seeing it financing fossil fuels. But of course, I mean, this is the concrete results of what happens when we end up in a situation where big polluters are sat around the negotiating table. And we're seeing it in participation. You know, we have the Dutch delegation putting business on their badges. I found out the other day. This shouldn't be happening. this really shouldn't be happening. And luckily there is a process here to stop it. I mean, we mentioned this at the beginning with the Telenoa dialogue. We also have the next May, we should be trying to tackle this. And I really do hope that this is tackled within this space, because I think it's essential. But do forgive my cynicism that I don't know how optimistic I am about that happening. And that's because if I look at the national level, who's been blocking, if I look at the US and the links of Trump with having ExxonMobil's ex-CEO in his cabinet, maybe they're not getting along very well, but in his cabinet, when we have the head of the EU delegation, Miguel Arias Cañete, he used to be president of not one, but 2 oil companies, whilst he was an MP in Spain. He only gave them up when he became a minister for the environment, ironically, in Spain. If we have these people so close to policy making, then it's no wonder that their interests, be it directly or indirectly, are finding their way into these halls. So I think we need to, as we were hearing, we need to really link these struggles. We need to move beyond thinking it'll be a technical fix here in this space, but there is energy around it. We're hearing, I mean, I was really heartened to hear what's been happening in Youngo between May and now, launching their own groups, what's been happening on the ground, what's been happening in many countries in the global south, demanding these changes, coming out onto the streets to demand these changes during the month of Reclaim Power. So I think this is a process that we need to, of course, put energy into, but we have to also be aware that the only way we're going to get this is by having influence at our national level and on the ground, and building those coalitions. And I'm really heartened to see the binding treaty to make sure corporations is happening in the UN, to make sure corporations are held accountable for their actions rather than being given more and more rights as we're doing through trade deals. So there are processes and there's energy building around them. But this is going to be a system change. This is going to be a paradigm shift. If we are to do this, the whole culture in the UNFCCC, the whole culture at national level of politics, of where power sits, of where democracy sits, is it going to sit with us, or are we going to give it away and it's going to float on up there? Where's it all going to sit? And this is something that we're all grappling with. And I think, at least I feel, we're in a better position than ever to try and make change happen. And luckily, because we've got very little time with climate change, with the figures coming out again and again, but from the people on this panel, hearing the changes that need to happen and thinking outside the box, is definitely doable. So please, I will invite you to listen to find out what happens in the open dialogue. Please stay within this movement. Please take part in pulling bingo away from Youngo. Do all these small things which together can hopefully make us far, far stronger. And then I will finish on our thing that we need to kick the big polluters out. So I do all join you, join the campaign, get involved, and do it not just up here in the UNFCCC, do it when you get home. Make sure this happens where you are, where we all are, and there's groups already working on this, so please do link up with them. And first of all, before we move on to our wrap, I'm going to do a big round of applause for all of our panelists. Thank you. And then, okay.
Yeah. All right, the guys do this one. Guys, gentlemen, the ladies do the clap. Come on. Yeah. I check it. Allow me to be cool, indigenous cool. Allow me to be cool, indigenous cool. Oh yeah, yes. Let me confess, yo. What do we need in 2023? System change and not climate change. What do we need in 2023? System change, not climate change. What do we need in 2023? What do we need in 2023? Yo, since Rio, things ain't getting better. There's greed for money and engineering of the weather. The abuse of energy comes with the price. Abuse of energy is a global heist. Yo, since Rio, things ain't getting better. There's greed for money and engineering of the weather. The abuse of energy comes with the price. Abuse of energy is a global heist. Yo, there is a need to complete sustainable energy. We must constrain 100% RE, rapidity of prevents climate disaster. Abomination is this destruction. Our communities will control the resources extracted. We will take back. We will fight back and we will take back. Because we will fight back and we will fight back. Yo, what do we need in 2023? Yo, what do we need in 2023? Yo, people sovereignty over resources. We are defenders of the earth, so let's join forces. Define the terms of engagement according to indigenous ways of, bringing community victory in the name of fairness, yo. People sovereignty over resources. We are defenders of the earth, so let's join forces. Yo, we are in trouble because of the misuse of the vital resources we possess and we use. We are in trouble because we believe in things not true, like the false energy created for me and you. In other words, it's energy that's wasted on delusion. We are made to buy a ticket into illusion. Into illusion. What do we need in 2023? System change, not climate. Tell me, what do we need in 2023? System change, not climate change. Lastly, what do we need in 2023? System change, not climate change. What do we need in 2023? System change, not climate. Silent. Since Rio, things are getting better. There's greed for money and engineering of the weather. The abuse of energy comes with a price. Abuse of energy is a global heist.
Thank you very, very much. Wow, this is the first time I've been involved in a rap act at COP. So thank you, Atama, that was wicked.
Thank you very much for all your comments. It has shaped the words that I've been putting together. So I please apologize because I've always kept my head down because I'm figuring out the rhymes and how to connect them. And those that didn't really connect is because I didn't have enough time to make it possible. Thanks.
So thank you. Also, go talk to your delegations. Tell them to kick big polluters out. Tell them to stop blocking progress. If you're from the EU, if you're from the US, if you're from Canada. If you're not, go tell your delegation to stand up to those countries, although we do realize it's pretty tough when they're going to ring up and try and take away all that development aid. But do it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Wow.